is sleeping. He's a traitor. In the soundproof cellar, this cat comes creeping. He's a traitor. Through the day, he takes a rock and roll.
Rock and roll traitor, rock and roll traitor.
But in the night, he takes a poppin' soul.
Rock and roll traitor, rock and roll traitor.
He's a rock and roll traitor.
Rock and roll traitor.
Yes, he's a rock and roll traitor.
Rock and roll traitor.
Well, he wears that drape and he combs his hair back.
He's a traitor.
And everybody thinks that he comes from way back.
He's a traitor.
But he's a part-time rocker, he's a plastic Ted.
Rock and roll traitor, rock and roll traitor.
How little does he know there's a price in his head.
Rock and roll traitor, rock and roll traitor.
He is a rock and roll traitor.
Rock and roll traitor.
Yes, he's a rock and roll traitor.
Rock and roll traitor.
Rock and roll traitor. In his big bell bottoms, you should see him moving.
He's a traitor.
With all his disco friends, he sets the party grooving.
He's a traitor.
But he's a feeble angel on his moped bike.
Rock and roll traitor, rock and roll traitor.
And if the guys find out they're gonna take his life,
Rock and roll traitor, rock and roll
then
traitor.
he's a rock and roll traitor.
Rock and roll traitor.
Yes, he's a rock and roll traitor.
Rock and roll traitor. He's a traitor.
All you hillbilly rockers better take some care.
He's a traitor.
Or when you see a guy you don't look no square,
He's a traitor.
you may find out that he's just a screw.
Rock and roll traitor, rock and roll traitor.
A guy you don't fit in any groove.
Rock and roll traitor, rock and roll
He
traitor.
is a rock and roll traitor.
Rock and roll traitor.
Yes, he's a rock and roll traitor.
Rock and roll traitor.
A rock and roll traitor. Ready, aim.